Hi, I'm Dr. Kristen Vaughn, and welcome to the third infographic video walkthrough for Hello Panic. In my first infographic, Anatomy of a Panic Attack, I talked about the nature of panic attacks, how common they are, and what kind of symptoms are involved. In my second infographic, Panic Attack Survival Guide, I talked about how you can stay out of the panic feedback loop. And today, in this infographic, I'm going to show you how you go from panic attacks by themselves to something called panic disorder. So panic attacks by themselves don't really have to necessarily interfere with your life, but in panic disorder, it can lead to restricted living. So I'll show you the progression from anxiety to restricted living. So first we have anxiety, and this is something we all have. Anxiety is a normal part of human life. But when we go to panic, we're talking about very severe anxiety. And I'm sure almost all of you know what I'm talking about. It's very intense and it's very frightening, to say the least. But next we have something called panic disorder, which is actually a mental health diagnosis. It involves several things. First of all, would be repeated panic attacks. And secondly would be during those panic attacks, the person feels like they're losing control and they may have a sense of dread or doom. The third thing that happens in panic disorder is very intense worry that a panic attack is going to happen again. So it was really scary and the person is very concerned that they're going to have another panic attack. So then what's involved would be fear or avoidance of places where panic attacks have occurred. So in response to the worry about another attack, the person is going to start to be afraid of and to avoid things that might cause another panic attack to happen. And then if you go a little further down the progression, the result of ongoing panic disorder without any sort of treatment or intervention is what I would call restricted living. And that's where you're really not living life according to your values, and you may even start to develop depression and become isolated from others. So what we can see is that in going from panic to panic disorder and restricted living, what's really happening here is the reaction to panic, not the anxiety or the panic itself. But if you're finding yourself over here with restricted living, I don't want you to despair, because guess what? The good news is it's reversible. And in my infographic number 4, I'm going to talk about how you can go from wherever you are here, and perhaps it's restricted living, all the way back to the beginning with anxiety. So you can become someone who just has anxiety from time to time, and that's just being a normal human being. But what determines why you might go from panic attacks to panic disorder and so on? Well, if you watched my second infographic, you might remember the panic feedback loop. And what's happening in going from panic to panic disorder is really like the panic feedback loop, but on a broader level. I would say that this is a phenomenon that's similar to a vortex. These different colors represent all the variables that contribute to you being pulled into the vortex. But remember, we're wanting to stay on the outside of the vortex. And it's helpful to know what all of these variables are so you can find your way out of the vortex. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The vortex gets set in motion because once the panic attack occurs, we have a strong reaction to it, right? We may have a sense of what it means, and we feel like what it means is bad. And we may say something like this: "Oh my gosh, that was awful. Oh man, what if that happens again?" And then we start to worry that it's going to happen again. And so then we start to alter our behavior to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And this starts to lead to bigger and bigger restrictions in our lives. So if this is happening to you, please don't judge yourself. It's simply human nature to want to get away from something that's uncomfortable. I don't know if you remember, but I told you guys that I've had panic attacks before, and I remember just how frightening it can be. So it's just our natural impulse to want to avoid them. I know a lot of my clients who struggle with panic also struggle with something else, and it's called judging. They judge and they blame themselves for what's happening in their lives. And I really want you to understand that that is actually making it harder. So instead of judging, criticizing, and blaming, let's really take a closer look and try to understand what causes panic to go to panic disorder. It's actually quite simple, and I'm going to cover the key concepts involved. One of the most important factors is our interpretation of what a panic attack means. So when we have a difficult experience, or any experience for that matter, our mind is going to immediately come up with an assessment about it, right? So it's going to say, this must mean that, and it's usually, again, something very bad. But it's often not just the feelings of panic that we fear, but it's the outcome of having a panic attack that we might fear. For instance, we may be concerned that if we had a panic attack, we would be embarrassed, that other people would see us and, we would be embarrassed about what was happening to us, or that we might go crazy. I mean, our minds are really good at coming up with worst case scenarios, right? There's a danger and our mind says, what could this mean? It must mean something bad, such as maybe I have some horrible illness, I'm going to die, I must be going crazy or losing control. And if we have those interpretations, as you remember from my first and second infographics, then that's just going to increase the anxiety. So what we make of the panic, what we think about it, is going to play a key role in terms of what ends up making it worse. So while interpretation is an important contributor, it's not the most important contributor. In fact, all of these contributors that I'm talking about are equally important, and that's why we didn't necessarily number them, because there's no order per se. And the colors don't actually mean that one is more meaningful than the other. And so we'll talk about the next contributor, which is going to be hypervigilance. And so what is hypervigilance? Well, hypervigilance is really just something that happens automatically. We're not consciously aware of it. So our brains are really designed to keep us out of danger. And so if our brain senses that we could be in danger, it will scan the environment to look for any potential signs. And that's what happens when we start to have panic attacks. We don't want them to happen, so our brains are thinking danger, danger. It's kind of like a smoke detector, right? And what our brains become is sort of like a very sensitive smoke detector that will go off even if we say light a candle. So again, without our awareness, we're kind of constantly scanning our body and the environment for any signs that a panic attack could occur. So just like anxiety itself, hypervigilance can be good. If we're in a dangerous situation, we're going to need to scan the environment to make sure that we're staying clear of danger. For example, a soldier who's in the battlefield is going to have to be hypervigilant if he wants to stay safe. But hypervigilance can become a problem when applied to our daily lives. And so why is hypervigilance a problem? Well, for one, it narrows our attention. Instead of noticing all the good things that are around us, we are hyper-focused on signs of danger and usually just negative, right? Just negativity. What could go wrong? And so we're missing all these other things that we could be experiencing and that we could be enjoying. Another thing that happens is that we start to become uncomfortable living in our own bodies, right? So our bodies have all kinds of sensations. And, maybe before you started having panic attacks, you didn't even pay attention to any of these sensations. But now it's like you're almost just uncomfortable in your own skin because any little sensation could mean a potential for panic attacks. And so now we're going to talk about avoidance. Avoidance. So avoidance, actually, come to think about it, I would say is kind of maybe the linchpin of this whole thing. While it's maybe not quite more important than the other contributors, it plays a pretty central role. So remember, what we're really wanting to do when we start to get into panic disorder is to prevent ourselves from having a panic attack. Well, that means that we'll have to plan to avoid things that might trigger the panic attacks. So when I talk about things that might trigger the panic attack, I'm talking about all kinds of things. So that can range from physical sensations in our body to places to situations that we think could trigger a panic attack. So when I talk about physical sensations that we might avoid, those would be, say, shortness of breath or an increased heart rate. Well, what could cause that? Drinking coffee, going for a run. So we may even start to change what we eat or drink or some of our exercise behaviors. When I talk about situations that we might avoid, that would be situations that could trigger a panic attack. It's very common that people would want to avoid places where they feel like they can't escape. And those places would be very commonly cars, so if you're especially a passenger in a car, airplanes, crowds. And so oftentimes people will avoid things like that because it could trigger a panic attack. And as well as even just going to the grocery store. They feel like being in crowds or in public places could trigger a panic attack, and it might be difficult to escape without being noticed or without embarrassment. And so again, avoidance is really where we start to see how panic really changes our lives. And that almost happened to me in some ways, right? Because I started to be afraid of flying on airplanes. I won't say that I actually canceled flights because of it, but I always had to have some Xanax with me, and I definitely dreaded those flights. And I don't know if you guys know, or if you know of John Madden, who was a famous football announcer, American football. And I don't know who knows this or not, but he was terrified of flying. And so he would actually drive all over the country in a bus. So it's not too uncommon to have these fears. But when we talk about avoidance and panic disorder, the fears start to really restrict someone's life. And now we're going to talk about reinforcement and the role that it plays in moving from panic attacks to panic disorder. Okay. So reinforcement is kind of a fancy psychological word, but basically what it means is the more we avoid, the more we avoid. So it kind of grows, right? So when we avoid something, and it's actually technically negative reinforcement, which means that when an anxious person avoids a situation, it removes their feeling of anxiety. And when we have this difficult feeling that goes away, we feel some relief. And so we're more likely to keep doing that. So again, when a scary feeling is removed by not engaging in the activity or going into the place, we feel relief and we're more likely to continue. So that's what reinforcement is. And in the extreme form, as we keep continuing to avoid because we're getting reinforced by it, is something called agoraphobia. And that is a condition where someone avoids so much that they're unable to even leave their home. And this is rare, but it is an extreme example of what happens with the vortex that I've been describing. Next, we'll talk about safety behaviors. So safety behaviors involve things that we do that actually show us in the end that we really can't handle anxiety. Examples of safety behaviors would be feeling like you always have to have someone with you to go somewhere, carrying around Xanax because it makes you feel more secure, or even sitting in the back row of a class or on the outside of an aisle in the movie theater. And I remember that that's something that I did, actually 2 of those things. I carried around a Xanax in my purse for several years, and that made me feel secure. Like, oh gosh, if I did have panic, I would be okay as long as I had this with me, which would imply that if I didn't have it with me, I'd be in trouble. So that was kind of reinforcing this idea that I couldn't handle the panic, which actually led to it growing in my life. Now, I want to say something really important about safety behaviors. I think almost all of us have some kind of safety behavior. And again, if this is you, I don't want you to feel bad about this. And I'm not asking you to give up your safety behaviors. But what I am going to help you to do is start to learn some other skills and tools that are going to help you to cope with a panic so that you won't need these safety behaviors and you can gradually give these up over time. And with medication, it's a very complex situation in terms of whether it's helpful or not. And I think oftentimes medication can be very helpful. And again, I'm not asking you to give up medication, but I don't think it's always a long-term solution. And that's what I'm trying to help people with in this program is coming up with a long-term solution to handle anxiety. And so next we'll talk about narrative. So narrative is an overarching concept that kind of weaves through all of this. And you may remember this concept from my other infographic. And what a narrative is just basically a story. It's what we are telling ourselves about what's happening to us in our life. And what ends up happening oftentimes with people who struggle with anxiety and panic disorder is we start to tell ourselves that something's wrong with us. We just can't handle things. And it might sound something like this. I am a person who can't do what other people can do because I have panic. And this is crucial because when we start to believe this, we start to act this out in our lives. And it's very common for such narrative to lead to things like depression and low self-esteem. And so it's going to be so important to pay attention to what is the story that you're telling yourself about your anxiety, because that can make a huge difference in how this plays out in the long term for you. So thank you so much for joining me. And I didn't do this to scare you about what can happen. I did this so I could educate you because I believe that education is a key to psychological freedom. And as I said before, even if you find yourself in the grip of panic disorder and that you're having a restricted life, this is reversible. You can go all the way from the end of the progression back to the beginning where you're just someone who has anxiety. So stay tuned because in my 4th infographic, The Journey to Recovery, I'm going to go through the steps that are going to help you get out of the vortex. You can get out of the vortex and you can be someone who lives a life with purpose and meaning, free from the grip of panic.